Hey everyone, so you know that feeling, I'm sure that all of us have had it at some point. You're in a room, you're in a conversation, you're at an event, and something feels off about it. Something feels wrong about it. But you can't quite put your finger on what it is. You can't quite articulate it. But you just know that something feels strange. Maybe it's you, maybe you're just, missing something. But along comes someone later on who pinpoints the feeling you are having and explains to you why you are having it, gives language to the experience for you, and then also affirms that you aren't crazy and that actually what you were sensing was something that was actually wrong. If you ever had that experience, that is the experience I had in reading Douglas Murray's book, The Madness of Crowds. Ignore this sticker. This is I got it from the library. Although I'm thinking about buying my own copy for my own bookshelf because I did really appreciate this book. But this is The Madness of Crowds. Came out in 2019 by Douglas Murray, someone I was not particularly familiar with before I read it, but he is a British journalist, and yeah, he essentially is trying to diagnose what he sees as a madness in generally Western culture right now. And he is walking into some pretty dangerous territory here with this stuff that he's taking on. But I'll talk briefly, quickly about the main idea, the research, the readability, and some of my takeaways from it. But his main idea is essentially, like I said, he's trying to diagnose what he sees as a madness that's kind of taken over some sort of like groupthink when it comes to issues of social justice. A lot of buzzwords around that, things like intersectionality, things like equity and race and gender, all of that kind of stuff. But he's trying to diagnose what actually is going on under the surface in our rhetoric and in our logic when it comes to these cultural movements. And he's trying to reveal what he sees as major contradictions that are under the surface in all these areas. Particularly, he structures the book and particularly moving through issues of sex, of gender, both with women and men, and then also the transgender conversation. Those are different chapters, and then also with the chapter on race. So, moving through each of those topics, all major cultural landmines, but he's trying to explore what's happening in our the contradictions that he sees in the rhetoric around all those things. So that's what the book's about. His research, not too much to say on this. It's primarily, he's a journalist, so it has that style to it, but his research is primarily current events, things like articles that are online or print articles in newspapers and interviews that have been conducted. So when he looks for evidence of these contradictions, for example, he usually cites recent events in interviews, dialogue and interviews, things like that. It's not so much, there's not a lot of research when it comes to like longer term history or psychology or philosophy. He does a little bit of that. There's a chapter on some Marxist thinking that he does some research on actual Marxism, but it's primarily more journalistic in the current events kind of way of writing. So just know that going into it. It is well footnoted, not footnoted, endnoted. There's notes, endnotes. If you can dig up stuff if you're interested in like a particular interview that he cites, you can find it pretty easily on your own. So it's helpful in that sense. The readability of it is interesting. It's conversational in a way. It's written kind of on a popular level, like a good journalist can do. But it's also very dense. So it's a conversational style. It's not academic prose, but it is dense because some of the arguments that he's really good at being precise in his language, but he moves through, when he's pulling out these contradictions, some of it's very dense. His own logic is very dense. And so I found myself rereading pages pretty frequently just so I could really try to understand, because I'd have that feeling of hitting the end of a paragraph and thinking, oh my gosh, this is like potentially revelatory. I need to reread this to make sure I'm like grasping it. So if that makes sense, it's not academically difficult to read, but it's a dense style, which isn't bad at all. It's just what it is. But the readability is, it's a very nuanced, which I think contributes to why it's something you want to like, at least I wanted to really carefully chew through. He's making a really careful argument precisely because I think he knows he's stepping into these bombs, these rhetoric cultural bombs. But it's not it's kind of a polemic because it's harsh in its criticism of the ways that we talk about these issues, but it's not a polemic in its tone. I didn't read it as an angry book, a fearful book, a desperate book. I read it as a very calm and convicted book, actually, of like, we need to reckon, in Douglas Murray's kind of view, we need to reckon with these deep, deep contradictions that are basically creating an insanity. So it's calm and convicted in that sense, but it is very pointed. And so you could call it a polemic, but I didn't read it as, it's not harsh, it's not desperate, it's not flailing, it's not angry, it's just, I read it as very, very confident. Which I think is partly why it's a really helpful book for this moment that we're in. And that leads me to some of my final thoughts. Overall, I thought this was just a very, a very sane, very carefully constructed, sensible diagnosis of a lot of what's going on. I think there are things, I personally have a religious framework from which I'm looking at things, which is different from Murray. So I have maybe some disagreements on some of the philosophical stuff, especially when we think about where do we go from here. I might have part ways with him on some things, but on a lot of his diagnosis of what's going on, I just thought he has his finger on it. He's articulating things that are really, really important. And so one of my big takeaways that he hits really hard that I completely agree with is that we have a profound amount of certainty in certain areas in our culture in which we have no business being that certain about at this moment. Profound certainty in very complicated issues around social inequities, very complicated issues around the psychology of gender and how one identifies. I mean, extremely complicated stuff that we have no business claiming such clear certainty on right now. And that resonated deeply with me as a call towards a more epistemic humility. I think this is a clarion call for that and such a needed book. And then also, I won't go too much into it for the sake of time. I want to keep this video short, but some of his constructive stuff at the end, he suggests some really, really helpful ways to look ahead and some helpful language to use when you feel some conflict in a conversation that you're stuck in our culture. But it's a very helpful book, particularly helpful in its diagnosis of what's going on, and with some practical takeaways, but it's more focused on the diagnosis. And for me, my overall sense that I got from it was, okay, I have some clear language now for some tensions that I've experienced around some of these contradictions that I feel like might be seeping into our discourse. So if that sounds at all of interest to you, I would definitely recommend reading The Madness of Crowds. I mean, I'd recommend this to honestly almost anyone that wants to be engaged in our culture right now, because you'll either be really challenged by it or you'll get language, at least you'll get language to talk more sensibly about what's going on in our world at this moment. So recommend Douglas Murray's book from 2019. If that sounds good to you, then definitely check it out. Grab it from your library, pick it up from your local bookstore. It's definitely going to get a place on my own shelf. So thanks for watching.